I found the email by accident, which is somehow worse than finding it on purpose, because it means I was not even suspicious enough to go looking, was not even alert enough to notice that something had already been happening for months while I sat in the same office drinking coffee and making small talk about weekend plans and acting like everything was normal. It was a Thursday, late afternoon, the kind of time when you are tired enough to make mistakes, but not tired enough to stop working. I was looking for a file on our shared drive, clicking through folders, trying to find a client presentation from 2 months back that I needed to reference, and I opened the wrong folder. Not even dramatically wrong, just one level off from where I meant to be. And there it was, sitting in a subfolder labeled Admin Notes, which should have been boring and procedural and completely irrelevant to anything I actually cared about. Except it was not notes. It was a document titled Transition Strategy, and the file date said it had been created 4 months earlier, which meant it had been sitting there the entire time I had been working late on pitches and client revisions, and believing that we were building something together. I opened it. I should not have, probably. There are arguments to be made about privacy and trust and boundaries in professional partnerships, but I opened it anyway, because I've never been good at walking away from things that do not make sense, and a document called Transition Strategy, hidden in a folder I had not known existed, did not make sense at all. What I found inside was worse than anything I had been prepared to discover. My name is Elliot Zhang, and I'm 34 years old, and until very recently I co-owned a design studio in Brooklyn called Framework, which is the kind of name that sounds clever until you say it out loud at a party and realize how many other design studios are called the same thing or something close enough that no one can tell the difference. I started it 6 years ago with a woman named Rachel Kemp, who I had worked with at an agency before we both got tired of making other people's visions look good and decided to try making our own. We split everything 50-50. Ownership, decisions, work, risk. It felt fair. It felt sustainable. It felt for a long time like the kind of partnership that actually worked because we respected each other enough not to need a hierarchy. Rachel was good at the business side of things in a way I was not. She liked talking to clients, liked negotiating contracts, liked the performance of confidence that comes with convincing someone to pay you what you were actually worth. I was better at the work itself, at turning an idea into something visual, at solving design problems that did not have obvious solutions. We complemented each other. That's what I told people when they asked how we made it work, and I believed it, because from where I was sitting it looked true. What I did not see, what I had not been looking for because I had no reason to suspect it, was that Rachel had been slowly, methodically building a version of the company that did not include me. The document I found was a roadmap, not a business plan, not a pitch deck, but an actual step-by-step guide for how to remove me from Framework without making it look like removal, without giving me grounds to fight back legally, without creating the kind of confrontation that would force anyone to choose sides publicly. It was organized into phases. Phase 1 was titled Credibility Shift, and it detailed how she had been positioning herself as the primary decision-maker in client meetings, how she had started using language that framed me as the executor rather than the co-creator, how she had been subtly redirecting credit for projects I had designed toward the studio as a whole rather than toward me specifically. There were bullet points, dates, notes about which clients had responded well to this framing and which ones might need more work. Phase 2 was called Dependency Reduction. This one was worse. It outlined a plan to gradually bring in freelancers and junior designers who could replicate my style, people she had been hiring and training without telling me they were being positioned as my replacement. There were names I recognized, people I had worked with on recent projects, people I had assumed were temporary help for overflow work, except according to this document, they were not temporary. They were strategic. They were being prepped to take over my role so that when I was eventually gone, the clients would not notice the transition. Phase 3 did not have a cute title. It just said Exit, and underneath that was a timeline that ended 3 months from the date I was reading this, which meant I had apparently been scheduled for removal and hadn't even known to start counting down.
The plan was simple. She would create situations where I looked unreliable, miss a deadline here, deliver something below standard there, have a client complaint that could have been avoided if only I had been more attentive. None of it dramatic enough to be obviously sabotage, just enough to build a pattern that she could then point to when she eventually sat me down and suggested gently, regretfully, that maybe it was time for me to step back, that maybe I had been struggling, that maybe it would be better for everyone if she bought me out at a valuation that would naturally be reduced because of the recent performance issues. I sat at my desk staring at this document for I don't know how long. Long enough that the office got darker, long enough that I missed 2 calls, long enough to understand that the version of reality I had been living in for the past 6 months had been a performance, and I was the only one who didn't know I was watching a scripted show. The thing that made it worse, the detail that I kept coming back to, even as I tried to process the larger shape of what I had found, was how thorough it was. This was not impulse. This was not a recent decision made in frustration or ambition. This had been planned carefully, executed patiently, adjusted based on results. There were notes in the margins about what had worked and what hadn't. There were revisions to the timeline based on how I had reacted to certain situations. She had been studying me, testing me, building a case against me using my own behavior as evidence, behavior she had been deliberately shaping without me realizing it. I want to tell you that I confronted her immediately, but I didn't. I closed the document. I cleared my browser history, even though we were the only 2 people with access to that drive. I went home and sat on my couch and tried to figure out what you do when you discover that the person you've been building something with has been actively working to erase you from it. The first thing I did, and I'm not proud of this, but I'm being honest, was doubt myself. I went through the last 6 months in my head trying to figure out if maybe I had actually been underperforming, if maybe the missed deadlines and client complaints she had documented were real, if maybe I was the problem all along and she had just been responding to something I couldn't see about myself. It took me 2 days to work through that, 2 days of reviewing my own files and emails and project timelines before I could confirm with certainty that no, I had not been failing. I had been set up to look like I was failing, which is different and which is somehow worse because it means the evidence exists even though the crime does not. The second thing I did was make copies. Every file in that folder, every document, every note, every revision to her plan. I backed it up in 3 places she couldn't access, and I made sure the timestamps were preserved because I had learned enough about documentation to know that dates matter more than almost anything else when you're trying to prove that something happened in a particular order. The third thing I did was wait. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I needed to make sure that whatever I did was the right move, the move that would actually protect what I had built, rather than just make me feel temporarily better. Rachel didn't know I found the document. I made sure of that. I kept showing up to work, kept taking meetings, kept delivering projects on time and under budget, kept being exactly the kind of partner I had always been. And I watched her. Not obviously, not in a way she would notice, but with the kind of attention you develop when you realize that someone has been performing for you, and you need to figure out where the performance ends and the person begins. What I noticed, once I was actually looking, was how good she was at it. The small comments in client meetings about how she had to step in to save a project, the casual mentions to freelancers about how she was the one really running things, the way she had started scheduling important calls during times I had other commitments, then summarizing those calls for me with just enough detail to make me feel included while actually cutting me out of the decision-making. She had been doing this months, maybe longer, and I had not noticed because I had been too busy doing the actual work to pay attention to who was getting credit for it. The opportunity I had been waiting for came 5 weeks after I found the document. We had a pitch meeting with a potential client, a tech company that wanted to redesign their entire brand identity, the kind of project that could define a studio for years if you got it right. Rachel had been leading the pitch development, which was normal. What was not normal was that when I asked to see the deck 2 days before the meeting, she told me it wasn't ready yet, that she was still refining it, that I should just trust her on this one. I didn't trust her, but I told her I did. The morning of the pitch, I showed up early. Earlier than her, earlier than the client, early enough to set up a conference room the way I wanted it set up. And when Rachel arrived and pulled up the presentation, I was ready. Because I had spent the previous 2 days building my own version, not to replace hers, but to run alongside. A presentation that showed clearly and undeniably which projects I had actually designed, which decisions I had actually made, which parts of our studio's success had come from my work rather than from our collective effort. I had documentation, before and after examples, client testimonials that mentioned me by name, a timeline that showed what we had accomplished in the 3 years before she started her transition strategy compared to what we had accomplished after. When the client asked Rachel to walk them through our process, I let her start. I let her do the introduction, let her set the tone.
Let her get comfortable. And then, halfway through, I interrupted. Not aggressively, not emotionally, I just said that I wanted to add some context. And then, I pulled up my presentation. I did not accuse her of anything. I did not mention the document I had found. I just showed the work. My work. The projects that had built Framework's reputation, the designs that clients kept coming back for, the creative solutions that had made us competitive in a market full of studios that looked exactly like us. The client asked questions, good questions, questions about process and collaboration and who was responsible for specific decisions, and I answered them honestly, specifically, with the kind of detail that only comes from actually doing the work rather than just managing it. Rachel tried to recover. She tried to reframe it as a collaborative effort, tried to smooth over the sudden tension in the room, tried to redirect the conversation back to the narrative she had been building. But the client was not interested in narrative anymore. They were interested in capability. And capability, when you actually demonstrate it, does not need a story around it. We got the project, but the client made it clear that they wanted me leading it. That night, Rachel called me. Not to apologize, but to ask what I was doing, why I had undermined her, whether I understood that I had just damaged our partnership in front of a client. I told her I had found the document. There was silence, long enough that I thought she might have hung up. Then she said that it was not what it looked like, that she had just been brainstorming, that everyone thinks about worst-case scenarios sometimes. I told her I had made copies, that I had documentation, that if she tried to execute any part of her transition strategy, I would make sure every client, every freelancer, every potential partner knew exactly how she operated. She hung up. We dissolved the partnership 6 weeks later. It was not friendly. It was not collaborative, but it was fair. Because I had evidence, and she did not have a defense. And sometimes that is all you need to make sure you leave with what is actually yours. I still run a design studio. Different name, different space, same work. Rachel still runs Framework, though I notice she does not use any of the portfolio pieces I designed anymore, which means her website looks a lot emptier than it used to. I do not regret the partnership. I regret not noticing sooner that it had ended long before I found that document. Because the worst betrayals are not the ones that happen suddenly. They are the ones that happen slowly, carefully, right in front of you, while you are too busy trusting someone to notice that they stopped trusting you months ago.